Some stories change quietly, not with a dramatic announcement, not with flashing headlines, but with a single legal decision made inside a courtroom. That is where the Whittaker story moved today. Patrick Roark waived his preliminary hearing, and with that single action, the case shifted out of magistrate court and into circuit court. At first glance, that might sound like a technical step, but legally, it changes the entire landscape of what happens next. A preliminary hearing is normally the stage where a judge decides whether there is enough evidence for a case to move forward. When that hearing is waived, the case skips that step. Instead, it goes directly to a higher court where prosecutors and defense attorneys begin preparing for a much larger legal process. And that is exactly where things stand now. Patrick Roark's case will proceed in circuit court. What happens next becomes slower, more formal, and in many ways, far less visible to the public. Information becomes harder to obtain. Court filings appear less frequently, and the quiet work of building a criminal case begins behind the scenes. But one thing is known. Patrick is not sitting in a jail cell tonight. Instead, he is reportedly under home confinement. An electronic monitor sits around his ankle. A small device, but one that carries enormous weight. The device tracks movement, records location, and ensures that the person wearing it cannot travel freely. For many defendants, it is considered a fortunate alternative to jail. You remain in your home. You sleep in your own bed. You see the same surroundings you always have. But freedom becomes conditional. Leaving the house requires permission. Travel is restricted, and every step is recorded by the court system. This arrangement is expected to continue for months, possibly until midsummer, unless the court decides otherwise. But the legal developments surrounding Patrick are only one part of a much larger story. Because the case did not begin in a courtroom. It began in the mountains of southern West Virginia, near a small place called Odd, a community so small that many Americans had never heard its name until the Whittaker family became known online. And yet, the landscape surrounding that tiny place is anything but small. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across thousands of miles. Rolling hills, dense forests, narrow roads winding through valleys locals call hollers. It is one of the most beautiful regions in the United States, and also one of the most misunderstood. When outsiders talk about Appalachia, the conversation often focuses on hardship. Coal mining towns that lost their industries, communities struggling with addiction, schools operating with limited resources. All of those things exist, but they are only part of the picture, because Appalachia is also a place of extraordinary natural beauty. Mist rising through the trees at sunrise, mountain ridges stretching toward the horizon, quiet roads where traffic is rare and silence is common. The people who settled these mountains centuries ago came largely from Scotland and Ireland. Immigrants who arrived during the 18th and 19th centuries searching for land and independence. Many of them found both in the isolated valleys of Appalachia. Over time, those settlers created communities shaped by the land around them. Tight-knit families, strong traditions, and a culture built around self-reliance. Isolation was part of that life. Mountain roads made travel difficult. Cities were far away, and many communities developed their own ways of surviving without outside help. That isolation is part of what shaped the Whittaker family's story, because for decades, they lived largely outside the attention of the wider world. Their home sat along a rural road. Their lives followed routines that had existed for generations. And for most of their history, very few people outside their community knew anything about them. Then the internet arrived, and everything changed. What had once been a private life became public. Videos appeared online. Millions of people saw the Whittaker family for the first time. Some viewers responded with sympathy. Others responded with curiosity. And some responded with criticism. Suddenly, a family that had lived quietly for decades became the subject of national attention. That attention brought donations. It brought visitors. And eventually, it brought investigations. The story that began with curiosity slowly transformed into something far more complicated. Authorities began asking questions about living conditions, medical care, and whether vulnerable individuals were receiving the support they needed. Those questions eventually led to the intervention that separated members of the Whittaker family. And the ripple effects of that intervention continue today. Because once legal systems become involved, stories rarely remain simple. The case involving Patrick Roark is one example of that complexity. Prosecutors believe crimes occurred. Defense attorneys argue their client deserves the presumption of innocence, and the court must decide what is true. But beyond the courtroom, another conversation continues. A conversation about responsibility, about who helped the Whittakers, about who may have harmed them, and about whether the attention brought by the internet ultimately improved their lives or disrupted them. Those questions have no quick answers, because real lives are rarely as simple as online debates suggest. What is clear is that the place where this story began still exists exactly as it always has. The mountains of West Virginia remain quiet. The roads remain narrow, and the communities scattered across those hills continue living their daily lives. For people who live there, Appalachia is not a symbol. It is simply home. A place where neighbors still sit on their porches in the evening, where families gather for small conversations, and where the outside world often feels very far away. The Whittakers once lived within that quiet rhythm, but today their story stretches far beyond those hills, into courtrooms, into headlines, and into the attention of millions of people who continue watching to see what happens next. In Part 2, the story moves deeper into the Appalachian landscape itself, because to understand the Whittaker story fully, you have to understand the place that shaped it. A place both beautiful and complicated. A place where history, hardship, and resilience have always existed side by side. To understand the Whittaker story, you have to understand the land where it unfolded. Because the mountains of West Virginia are not just scenery. They shape the lives of the people who live there. Long before the Whittaker family ever appeared online, long before YouTube channels began discussing them, the Appalachian Mountains had already been shaping generations of families. The region is ancient. Geologists estimate that the Appalachian Mountains formed more than 480 million years ago, older than the Rocky Mountains, older than many of the mountain ranges across Europe. Time has worn them down. Instead of sharp peaks, the Appalachians rise in long rolling ridges covered with dense forests. Mist often hangs in the valleys at sunrise. From a distance, the mountains appear layered, one ridge behind another, blue and gray shapes fading into the horizon. People who grow up in Appalachia often say the same thing. The mountains feel protective, but they can also feel isolating. For early settlers, that isolation was both a blessing and a challenge. During the 18th and 19th centuries, immigrants from Scotland and Ireland moved into these hills. Many were farmers looking for land. Others were families escaping political unrest and economic hardship in Europe. They found something in Appalachia that reminded them of home. The terrain looked familiar. The climate felt similar. And the mountains provided distance from crowded coastal cities. Small communities began forming along narrow valleys and riverbeds. Over time, those communities developed a unique culture. Family ties were strong. Neighbors relied on one another, and traditions passed down through generations. But geography also limited opportunity. Mountain roads were narrow. Travel between towns could take hours. Schools and hospitals were often far away. Economic life centered around the industries that could survive in mountainous terrain. The most powerful of those industries was coal. For more than a century, coal mining shaped the economy of West Virginia. Entire towns grew around mining operations. Families depended on coal companies for jobs, for housing, sometimes even for basic supplies. Coal was not just an industry. It was the foundation of life for many Appalachian communities. But industries rarely remain permanent. Beginning in the late 20th century, the coal economy began to decline. Automation reduced the number of workers needed in mines. Environmental regulations changed how coal could be extracted, and alternative energy sources slowly began replacing coal in parts of the United States. The result was economic shock. Many towns lost their largest employers. Businesses closed. Young people moved away searching for work in larger cities. Communities that once thrived began struggling. This economic shift created a complicated reality. On one hand, the Appalachian region remained breathtakingly beautiful. On the other, many families faced long-term financial hardship. That combination of beauty and struggle is something outsiders often misunderstand. Visitors arrive and see the forests, the rivers, the quiet mountain roads, but they do not always see the economic pressures that exist beneath that beauty. The Whittaker family lived within that environment, near the small community of Odd, a place that sits quietly within the hills of southern West Virginia. If you drive through that area today, the landscape looks almost untouched. Trees cover the hillsides. Narrow roads twist between small houses and wooded hollows. Traffic is light. In some places you can drive miles without seeing another car. For people who grew up in busy cities, that quiet can feel almost surreal. But for families who have lived there for generations, it is simply normal. Life moves at a slower pace. People spend more time outdoors. Porches become gathering places where neighbors talk in the evenings. The Whittaker porch became one of the most recognizable images of the family. For years, members of the family could often be seen sitting outside, watching the road, talking with neighbors, sometimes simply enjoying the mountain air. To outsiders, that scene looked unusual, but within Appalachian culture, it was familiar. Front porches have always been central to social life in rural communities. They are places where conversations happen, where people share stories, where families gather after long days. They are also places where time moves slowly, something modern life rarely allows. But while the landscape surrounding Odd is beautiful, the region also faces challenges that cannot be ignored. One of the most devastating has been the opioid crisis. Over the past 2 decades, addiction to prescription painkillers and other opioids spread through many parts of Appalachia. Communities already struggling economically were hit especially hard. Families lost loved ones. Hospitals faced overwhelming numbers of overdose cases. Entire towns began confronting a public health emergency. West Virginia became one of the states most deeply affected. For some communities, addiction changed daily life. Law enforcement resources stretched thin. Medical systems struggled to keep up, and families faced heartbreaking personal battles. When people discuss the Whittaker story, they often overlook how deeply these regional struggles shaped the environment around them. The family did not live in isolation from the wider challenges affecting Appalachia. They lived inside them. Economic hardship, limited healthcare access, and a region still recovering from decades of industrial decline. But there is another change happening across West Virginia today, one that may reshape the region's future. Remote work. As technology allows more people to work from home, some Americans are leaving large cities and moving into rural areas. Places that once seemed too remote now look attractive to people seeking quiet landscapes and lower living costs. West Virginia has become part of that trend. Remote workers and retirees have begun purchasing property in mountain communities. Some developers have started building private residential areas designed for people who want scenic views and peaceful surroundings. In certain areas, land that once belonged to long-time residents is being purchased by investment groups or limited liability companies. These companies often buy rural properties and hold them as long-term investments. The idea is simple. Land that once seemed overlooked may become valuable as more people discover the beauty of the Appalachian region. This process sometimes leads to what economists call rural redevelopment. But for long-time residents, it can also create uncertainty. Property ownership changes, communities shift, and familiar places sometimes disappear. Some observers have wondered whether similar forces may have affected the land where the Whittaker family lived. In certain rural areas of West Virginia, property that once belonged to families for generations has been purchased by outside companies. When that happens, the people who once lived there sometimes have little control over what comes next. In the Whittaker case, questions about property ownership have circulated online, but clear answers remain difficult to confirm. What is certain is that the region surrounding Odd continues changing. Slowly, quietly, just as it has for generations. The mountains remain, the forests remain, but the people living among them are navigating a world that looks very different from the one their grandparents knew. And somewhere within those changes sits the Whittaker story, a story that began on a quiet porch, a story that eventually reached millions of viewers, and a story that now intersects with legal proceedings, investigations, and national attention. Yet if you travel through the mountains today, the landscape looks exactly as it always has. Rolling hills, narrow roads, and communities where life still moves at a pace the rest of the world rarely sees. The beauty of Appalachia remains undeniable, but the forces shaping the future of those mountains continue shifting. And the Whittaker story exists at the center of that complicated moment in time. When Patrick Roark waived his preliminary hearing, the legal process moved into a very different phase. For many viewers following the story online, the phrase, "waive the preliminary hearing," sounds technical, almost routine. But in the structure of the American legal system, it marks an important shift. A preliminary hearing normally serves one purpose: to determine whether prosecutors have enough evidence to justify moving a criminal case forward. During that hearing, a judge reviews the basic claims presented by the prosecution. Witnesses may testify. Evidence may be briefly introduced, and the court decides whether probable cause exists to continue the case. But when a defendant waives that hearing, the process skips that step entirely. Instead of arguing about probable cause in a lower court, the case advances directly to a higher court where the stakes are significantly larger. In Patrick Roark's situation, that means the case has now moved into circuit court. Circuit courts handle the most serious criminal cases in the state of West Virginia: felony trials, major civil disputes, and legal proceedings where the consequences can reshape someone's life. Once a case reaches circuit court, the process becomes slower and more formal. Legal filings grow more detailed. Attorneys begin preparing for the possibility of trial, and much of the activity shifts behind closed doors. For viewers trying to follow the Whittaker case from the outside, this is often the point where information becomes harder to obtain. Magistrate courts are relatively open. Hearings happen quickly. Records are easier to access. Circuit courts operate differently. Evidence is reviewed carefully. Procedural motions are filed. Attorneys negotiate. Sometimes cases move forward. Other times they pause for months while legal arguments unfold. And that is where Patrick Roark now finds himself. Waiting for the next court date. Waiting for prosecutors to present their case. Waiting for the defense team to decide how they will respond. Meanwhile, the conditions of his release remain in place. Patrick is reportedly under electronic monitoring. A device attached to his ankle tracks his movements. The system is designed to ensure compliance with the court's rules. Home confinement is often described as a middle ground between jail and freedom. The person wearing the monitor is not incarcerated, but their movements are restricted. Every trip outside the home must follow strict guidelines. In many cases, Individuals are permitted to leave only for approved activities such as court appearances, medical appointments, or meetings with attorneys. Everything else becomes limited. Daily routines change. Freedom becomes conditional. For someone used to normal mobility, that change can feel dramatic. But in the eyes of the court, the arrangement represents an opportunity, a chance to remain outside a jail cell while the legal process continues. The court expects cooperation, compliance, and patience, because the next phase of the case could take time. Felony investigations rarely move quickly. Prosecutors must examine evidence carefully. Witness statements are reviewed. Financial records may be analyzed, and investigators may continue gathering information even after the case enters court. This stage of the process often determines whether the case eventually goes to trial, or whether negotiations occur behind the scenes. Plea agreements are common in criminal cases. Sometimes prosecutors offer reduced charges in exchange for a guilty plea. Other times, defendants fight the accusations and prepare for trial. At this moment, it is impossible to know which path the Patrick Roark case will follow. But one thing remains clear. The allegations surrounding the Whittaker story have reached a level where the legal system is now responsible for determining what actually happened. And that distinction matters, because the internet often moves faster than the courts. Online discussions frequently reach conclusions long before evidence is tested in a courtroom. But the legal process operates differently. It requires proof, testimony, documents, and arguments presented before a judge or jury. Until that process unfolds, the outcome remains uncertain. Yet outside the courtroom, the emotional debate surrounding the Whittaker family continues. Many people believe the family was exploited. They believe promises were made, money was discussed, and the results did not match what supporters expected. Others argue that outside intervention brought attention to a situation that needed help. They believe the exposure improved living conditions, provided resources, and introduced medical care that had not previously existed. Both perspectives continue circulating online, and both are shaped by the same set of images that first introduced the Whittakers to the world. Videos showing the family sitting on their porch. Scenes of daily life in rural Appalachia. Moments that captured curiosity, sympathy, and controversy all at once. But the legal case itself must move beyond impressions. Courts cannot rely on online narratives. They must rely on evidence. And that evidence is now being examined within the structure of circuit court. As that process unfolds, another question lingers in the background. What about the other people involved in the Whittaker story? Patrick Roark was not the only person who entered the family's life during the period when their story gained national attention. Other individuals also appeared in videos and discussions surrounding the family. Some supporters believe those individuals should also face legal scrutiny. Others argue that responsibility lies solely with those who directly handled financial matters. At the moment, those questions remain unanswered. Investigations sometimes expand over time. Additional charges can appear months after the original case begins, or the case may remain focused only on the defendant already facing court. Observers watching the situation have speculated that further developments could occur. Some believe additional charges may eventually be filed. Others believe the legal system may limit the case strictly to the allegations already presented. But speculation is not evidence, and the court will ultimately determine what happens next. For now, the focus remains on Patrick Roark and the legal path unfolding before him. A path that now leads through circuit court. A system designed to move carefully, methodically, and sometimes slowly. While the legal process advances step by step, the place where the Whittaker story began continues existing quietly in the mountains of southern West Virginia. The road leading toward it still winds through forests and narrow hollows. The air still carries the same mountain quiet, and the porch that once became a symbol of the Whittaker story now sits empty. For years, people driving down that road might have seen members of the family sitting outside, watching the road, talking with neighbors, living their daily routines. Today, that scene has changed. The porch is no longer the center of the story. Instead, the focus has shifted to courtrooms, investigations, and the long process of determining what actually happened behind the scenes. While the legal process surrounding Patrick Roark moves slowly through the courts, the people at the center of the entire story are no longer living the life they once knew. The Whittaker family. For decades, their world revolved around a single place. A modest home near yard, a narrow mountain road, a front porch where much of their daily life unfolded. That porch became one of the most recognizable images associated with the family. Viewers who first discovered the Whittakers online often remember the same scenes. Ray sitting outside holding up his pants. Timmy with a coloring book. Family members talking, laughing, or simply watching the quiet road in front of the house. The porch was more than just a piece of wood attached to a house. It was their social space, their daily routine, their connection to the outside world. For people living in rural Appalachia, front porches have always served that purpose. They are where neighbors wave when they drive by, where family members gather in the evening, where the slow rhythm of mountain life unfolds. And for the Whittakers, that rhythm remained mostly unchanged for many years. Before cameras arrived, before internet attention exploded, before the outside world began debating what should happen to them, the family lived in that same place for decades. Through economic hardship, through the decline of the coal industry in West Virginia, through the waves of addiction that swept across many Appalachian communities during the opioid crisis. Their lives were not easy, but they were familiar. Then the internet arrived, and suddenly the Whittakers were no longer invisible. Videos began circulating. Millions of people saw the family for the first time. Some viewers reacted with compassion. Others responded with curiosity, and some reacted with harsh criticism. The attention brought both help and controversy. Donations were raised. Supplies were delivered. Supporters began discussing ways to improve the family's living conditions. But attention also brought scrutiny. Questions began appearing online. Questions about medical care, about finances, about whether the family fully understood the agreements being made around them. Eventually, those questions reached people responsible for investigating situations involving vulnerable adults. Adult Protective Services. Once those agencies become involved, their responsibility is simple in theory but complicated in practice. Protect the individuals who may not be able to protect themselves. Investigators examine living conditions. They evaluate medical needs. They assess whether individuals have the ability to make certain decisions independently. And if concerns reach a certain threshold, authorities can intervene. That intervention eventually occurred in the Whittaker case. Members of the family were removed from the home. Medical evaluations began, and the familiar life that had existed for decades changed almost overnight. The Whittaker porch became quiet. No more daily gatherings. No more neighbors driving by to see the family outside. No more routine that had shaped their lives for generations. Instead, different members of the family were placed in separate care situations. Medical facilities, supervised environments, settings designed to provide structured support. For many supporters watching online, that moment was deeply emotional. Because regardless of how someone felt about the conditions of the home, one fact was undeniable. The Whittaker family had lived together for decades. Their bond was strong, and separating them meant dismantling a life that had existed for generations. Supporters of the intervention believed the change was necessary. They argue that medical care and professional supervision will improve the health and safety of the individuals involved. Critics believe something precious was lost. They argue that a family that stayed together through hardship was broken apart by outsiders who did not fully understand their world. Both perspectives exist today, and the truth may contain elements of both. Because situations involving vulnerable individuals are rarely simple, authorities must consider safety, medical needs, legal responsibility. But families also carry emotional bonds that cannot easily be measured by investigations or reports. That tension is part of what makes the Whittaker story so complicated. And it is why the legal case surrounding Patrick Roark has become so symbolic. For some observers, the case represents accountability. They believe people who entered the Whittakers' lives and handled money or influence must answer for their actions. For others, the legal case represents something different. They believe it reflects a system trying to understand a situation that grew far larger than anyone expected. Meanwhile, the Whittakers themselves remain largely silent within the public conversation. They are no longer sitting on the porch where millions of viewers first saw them. Their lives are unfolding quietly within medical evaluations, social services programs, and supervised care environments. Those environments may provide resources that were previously unavailable. Medical specialists, structured routines, support staff trained to assist individuals with specific needs. But they also represent something unfamiliar. New surroundings, new people, new rules. For individuals who spent most of their lives in one place, those changes can feel overwhelming, even when the intention behind them is protection. Some supporters still hope the Whittaker family might one day spend time together again. Perhaps supervised visits, perhaps shared activities, perhaps moments where the familiar bond of family can return in some form. Others believe the separation may remain permanent, that the system will determine different long-term care paths for each individual. Right now, those questions remain unanswered. And while the legal system focuses on the allegations surrounding Patrick Roark, the deeper story continues unfolding quietly in the background. A family adjusting to a new reality. A porch that once symbolized their life now standing empty. And a mountain road that still winds through the forests of southern West Virginia exactly as it always has. The Whittaker story did not begin in a courtroom. It began on a quiet porch in the hills near Odd. For decades, the family lived a life that few people outside their community ever noticed. Their routines were simple, their world was small, and the mountains around them provided both beauty and isolation. Then the internet arrived. What followed was something the family could never have imagined. Millions of viewers suddenly knew their names. Videos spread across social media. Donations appeared. Strangers debated what should happen to them. Some people wanted to help. Others wanted answers. And eventually the attention grew large enough that authorities stepped in. Now the situation surrounding the Whittakers exists in two places at once. Inside the legal system, where the case involving Patrick Roark is moving through circuit court in West Virginia. And outside the courtroom, where people across the internet continue asking the same questions. Did attention help the Whittakers? Or did it change their lives in ways no one expected? The truth may not be simple. Exposure brought resources and support. But it also brought scrutiny, investigations, and ultimately the separation of a family that had lived together for decades. Today, the porch where so many viewers first saw the Whittakers sits quiet. The road is still there. The mountains are still there. But the life that once unfolded in that place has changed. What happens next will not be decided by YouTube debates or online opinions. It will be decided by courts, investigators, and the long process of determining what truly happened behind the scenes. And whatever the final outcome may be, the Whittaker story stands as a reminder. Real lives exist behind every viral moment. And sometimes the attention that shines a light on a story also changes it forever. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.